Welcome to training. If you would like to know a little bit more about the gap and what that means here at GCU, as well as alignment, please stay tuned. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples, but first I want to talk to you guys about what a gap means. So when we're talking about a gap, we're talking about something that's established by empirical literature and is something that needs to be studied and has not yet been studied. When we say empirical literature, we mean generally peer-reviewed literature that exists within journal articles. There are some other places, but typically that's what you're going to see. You can access that through the GCU library. When we talk about the gap, there's a couple, well, quite a few actually, ways to establish the gap. I'm going to go through 3 of those today. One of those is to simply take a quote from literature, and they say that something needs to be done, so that's what you are going to do. For example, let's say that we have Smith and Jones 2017, and they suggest that we study chairs' perceptions and why chairs choose which documents pass and which documents do not. So what you do is you go through, you find that quote in literature, and you go, this is what Smith and Jones 2017 suggested needs to be done, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask chairs, why do you choose, or how do you choose, which ones go through and which ones do not, which ones pass, which ones fail? So one way is to use a gap from literature. The other way is to look at limitations of a study and address a limitation. Sometimes these are explicitly stated, sometimes they are not explicitly stated. For example, let's take our Smith and Jones 2017 article. Let's say that they actually went through and asked some chairs these questions. But then you look at it and you see that they only asked male chairs these questions. So you come in and you go, hey, we have a male's perspective, but what about a female's perspective? There's a limitation here. They only studied males, they didn't examine females. So you come in and you go, I am going to ask females these questions regarding how they choose which documents pass and which documents fail. One of the things that I want you guys to be very careful about, though, is a logical flow between a statement or a limitation and your actual study. So let's say, back to our Jones study, Smith and Jones, let's say that they said that more research needs to be done regarding females. Well, if that's the statement, you can't really take that statement out of context and then run with that statement and study, say, female vets who have PTSD. So there has to be a logical transition between the statement in literature and your actual study that you're going to do. So that's 2 actual ways to establish a gap. Quote from literature, limitation. You can often find these at the very end of articles under the future study ideas or recommendations for future research, or the limitation section. But again, you have to make sure that that logic is set. The other way, which is actually much more common within empirical literature, the other way to establish the gap is to do what I've heard described as putting together a puzzle. So let's say I handed you a box and I said, hey, can you put this puzzle together? Tell me the missing piece. If I ask you to tell me what piece is missing, you can't just do it without putting the puzzle together, right? You have to put the puzzle together first. Then you look within the context of the puzzle and you can easily tell me which piece is missing. So you might say it's the 3rd from the upper right-hand side, 3rd down, 4th from the left, something like that. And you can describe the context of that piece. So it has flowers on it, whatever it might be. That's kind of what we're doing with most literature when we talk about a gap. We're synthesizing literature. In other words, we're taking this concept here, this concept here, this concept here, and we're creating a combination that becomes our research study. So this person may have studied this concept, these ones studied this one, these ones studied this one, but no one has studied all 3 of them together with this particular group. So that's what I'm going to do. But you have to build the puzzle. So before you can build the puzzle, so to speak, you have to actually know empirical literature, be able to figure out what exists in order to know what's missing. And then you have to be able to defend that. So again, it has to be logical. When we say defend, we really mean pointing back to empirical literature to go, here's what gives me authority to do what I'm doing and the way that I'm doing it. So you guys will discover that within dissertation and within research, the authority no longer lies within me as an individual. It really relies with that research, or sits with that research. So it can't be something that I just want to do and therefore I'm going to go and do this. It has to be something that so-and-so said that this needs to be done, or literature abroad has studied all of this but hasn't studied this, therefore I'm going to go do it. So that's a little bit about the gap. Hopefully that's helpful. But now I want to run into a couple of examples. And so the first one that I want to share with you is just a quantitative example. And I've got a gap up here. The other important thing about the gap, let me stop sharing this real quick. The other really important thing about the gap here at GCU is it has to be studied, but it has to be set by recent empirical literature. When we say recent empirical literature, what do we mean? We mean that the gap needs to be established within 5 years from date of defense. Now there's 2 dates of defense here at GCU. One is a proposal, the other is the dissertation. So if I had a learner coming to myself and I was their chair at the end of 2017, I would want that gap to be established within the last 3 years, 17, 16, 15. The reason for that is, let's assume that we have our proposal defense in 2018. Well, as we know, sometimes life happens and we may not get to that dissertation defense as quickly as we'd like. So let's assume that the dissertation defense happens in 2019. Well, if I stick within that 3-year limit at the end of 2017, 19, 18, 17, 16, 15. I am now within that 5-year limit that GCU sets to establish the gap. Okay, so having added that piece, let me go back to my screen share here. So let's assume that we have a gap, and our gap is, it's unknown whether time spent on a document and the level of depression of the chair predicts the chair's rating of the proposal. So let's assume that this has been established by recent empirical literature, and then I can back it up, right? It's defendable, it's current, and it's logical. So assuming that all of those things stand with this gap, let's go ahead and run through 5 of our 10 strategic points using this gap. So you guys are going to notice that when we say that something needs to be aligned, it's actually a lot of repetitiveness, which you're going to see as we go through here. So at GCU, the problem statement starts a very particular way. If it doesn't start this way, it is incorrect. The way that every problem statement starts at GCU is, it is not known. What comes next depends on whether we're doing a qualitative study or a quantitative study. Since we're doing a quantitative here, I'll tell you the 2 different options that come next. It is not known if and to what extent, or it is not known if and to what degree. For the sake of argument, we're just going to use one of those. So it has to start one of those 2 ways for quantitative studies. If it starts any other way and it's a quantitative study, it is incorrect. So now that we have our starting here, it is not known if and to what extent, or it is not known if and to what degree, but I'm going to stick with extent. We are going to take our gap above and fit it into the sentence. So it is not known if and to what extent, and then we're going to say chair's time spent on a document and current, we'll say level of depression predict the chair's rating of the proposal. So all I'm doing is taking that gap, which needs to be very specific, it needs to be studyable, doable, feasible, and then I'm going to take that gap, turn it into my problem statement. So here's my problem statement at GCU. It is not known if and to what extent chair's time spent on a document and level of depression predict the chair's rating of the proposal. What I'm going to do now is copy this if and to what extent to the end of my sentence. Literally going to copy it, and we're going to put it into our purpose statement here. But first, I want to show you guys how a purpose statement starts. Just like a problem statement has a very specific start, the purpose statement does as well. The purpose of this. What comes next is going to have to be 5 different things. We're going to talk about our method. We're going to talk about our design. We're going to throw in our problem statement and I copy and paste it. We're going to give our target population. And some of the paperwork you might see sample listed here instead of target population. The reason I stick with target population is because sample requires a number to go with it, and we don't need a number in our purpose statement. So target population, and then location. Now a little bit about the method. Method here at GCU, there's, well, and actually research at large, is quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative deals with numbers, it's numerical. Qualitative deals with like words, non-numerical stuff. And so in this instance, we're going to be dealing with numbers. So I know that my method is going to be quantitative. Now there are 5 different GCU pre-approved designs. There's experimental, quasi-experimental, causal comparative, which despite its name cannot assess causal claims. And then we have correlational, and then finally descriptive. Anything dealing with relationships or predictions, that's going to fall underneath the correlational design. And so that's going to be our design here is correlational. So the purpose of this quantitative correlational, I'm going to throw in a few words here just so that this problem statement fits in. Study is to assess, and then I'm going to literally paste my problem statement in here. If and to what extent chairs time spent on a document, level of depression predict the chair's ratings of the proposal. Now I have to talk about our target population. Population is a broad group. The target population is a subset of that broader group. And then your sample comes from that target population. So we're going to say that we are going to study chairs for chairs at a private university. And then we have to give our location. So we're going to say the Southwest. We want to be careful about our location because we want to be sure that we're specific, but not so specific that we lose the confidentiality of our participants. So just something to remember, always keep ethics in the back of your head so that you can always be ethical and mindful of what's going on in your study. So here's our purpose statement. The purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to assess if and to what extent chairs' time spent on a document and level of depression predict the chair's rating of the proposal for chairs at a private university in the Southwest. I am now going to take our problem statement again, the one that I copied up here, and I'm going to create some research questions. As an aside, GCU requires that we generally have at least 2 research questions. We like to have an overarching question. In the statistical realm, this is a really good thing because there are some statistical tests where we need to test everything at once. So instead of doing, for example, multiple t-tests between A and B, B and C, C and D, A and D, so on and so forth, we want to first run potentially an ANOVA. And the ANOVA is what helps control for type 1 experimental-wise alpha or error rates, kind of out of the scope of this particular training. But needless to say, there is a time and a purpose for an overarching question. In this instance, I'm going to put my problem statement down here, and I'm going to turn it into our overarching question. Now, our research questions cannot be yes, no. If they're yes, no, they're not really informative. So we could ask simply, if we wanted to turn this into a yes, no question, is, does chair's time spent on a document and level of depression predict the chair's rating of the proposal? Yes, it does. Okay, great. Well, what does that tell us? It might predict a little bit, might predict a lot. We don't know because we're not asking that question. So instead of does, let's leave in here our phrasing. To what extent does chair's time spent on a document and level of depression predict the chair's rating of the proposal? So this gives us a lot more refined information. Might predict it a lot, might predict it a little bit, might not predict it at all, but it's better than a yes, no. So this is going to be our overarching question. And then I'm going to break these into 2 sub-questions. So since this is a prediction, one of the things that I might want to know is how do each of these individual predictor variables deal with this rating? And so I'm going to look at how they relate. To what extent does chair's time spent on a document, and instead of predict, I'm going to say relate to the chair's rating of the proposal. And then I'm going to do the same thing, but instead of time spent on a document, I'm going to look at just level of depression. And again, I'm not going to predict, and I'm going to look at relate to the chair's ratings. So we have 3 questions here. We have our overarching question looking at prediction. We have our 2 sub-questions that are looking at individual correlations. One between time spent on document and rating of proposal, the other between chair's level of depression and rating of the proposal. So I'm going to just come in here and label these for the sake of making it a little bit more clear. RQ1, and then we'll have RQ2, RQ3. Okay, so we've got 3 research questions. But again, hopefully it's very clear to see that there's tight alignment between our problem statement here and our research questions here. One of the important things about the research questions is every variable in our study has to be tied back to a theoretical framework. So the variables in this study is time spent on a document, level of depression, and then finally chair's rating of the proposal. So these are our 3 variables. So we have to be able to tie each of these 3 variables back to a theoretical framework. That might take one theoretical framework if it described time spent on a document, level of depression, and chair's rating. But more than likely than not, in this particular instance, it may take 2 or 3. So whatever that theory is, we need that theory to drive those research questions, to drive that study. So we have to be able to show how does our theory drive the study, and the way that we do that is by pointing every variable back to a theoretical framework. So I'm going to take this first research question here. I'm going to paste it for our hypotheses. As an aside, we always list our null hypothesis first. That's standard within the field. And then we list our alternative hypothesis. So the HA1 is going to represent the alternative hypothesis for our first research question. The H01 represents the null hypothesis for our first research question. So I'm going to take this null, I'm going to take our research question and turn it into a statement or a hypothesis. So the null means that nothing happens. There's nothing there. So what we're going to say is chair's time spent on a document and level of depression do not significantly, I can type, we'll be doing well, predict, and then the chair's rating of the proposal. I turn that into a statement. And let me get rid of our italics here. There we go. Chair's time spent on a document and level of depression do not significantly predict the chair's rating of the proposal. I added the word significantly in here. So if we don't have significantly, it's going to be a little bit more difficult or impossible to test statistically. So let's say that there was a prediction, a very, 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 very minor prediction. We wouldn't know if that addresses this hypothesis or not. And so I like to add significantly in here. I'm going to copy and paste this for our alternative. And now I'm going to say do significantly predict. So the alternative are all of our other options. The null here is do not. Therefore, the alternative is that it does. So I'm going to do the same thing for our other research questions. Every research question has its own null and alternative hypothesis. And again, this is specifically for the quantitative side. If we were looking at qualitative, then we would be looking at a phenomenon. Okay, do not significantly relate to. So give me just a second as I change these up a little bit. Chair's level of depression, and this is going to be does. Got to make sure that we keep our grammar in there. Chair's level of depression does not significantly relate to the chair's rating of the proposal. And then it does significantly relate. So if I pull this back up and go back up to our research questions, you're going to see how this research question 2 is very aligned with our hypothesis for that research question. This one is asking about chair's time spent on a document. This one is also, the hypothesis is also talking about chair's time spent on a document. Question 3 is looking at level of depression and how it relates to the chair's rating. And so our hypothesis of 3 is looking at level of depression and how it relates to the chair's rating. So just be aware that there has to be a direct tie between these research questions and the hypotheses. Otherwise, it is out of alignment. The last thing that I'm going to bring up is our method and design. So method and design, the reason I'm bringing this up is because, one, it's one of our 10 strategic points. The other thing is I find that there's a lot of folks who, especially early on, get a little bit confused about what is the method, which one is the design. So I'll sometimes ask folks, which one of these is the method? And the response that I get is, So what I ask folks to do is just put quantitative method, correlational design. So as you're going back and looking at these 10 strategic points, it becomes really clear which one is the method, which one is the design. So here's our example of a quantitative gap and 5 of our 10 strategic points that are highly aligned with a few little tidbits in between. So now what I want to do is move on to the qualitative side. So again, there's quantitative method, there's qualitative method. We do actually allow folks to do a mixed design, but we just really don't recommend that. The reason for that is it's like doing 2 dissertations. You have to do all the quantitative, you have to do all of the qualitative, and that just seems like a lot of headache. We'd rather get you guys graduated, get you able to do this when you get out. So the qualitative gap is one that I referenced a little bit earlier. How do chairs choose which proposals pass or fail? So let's assume again that this is a logical gap that has been established by recent empirical literature. So that's what we're going to assess. So we're going to turn this into our problem statement. As I said previously, every problem statement starts the same way. It is not known. And then dependent, again, quantitative or qualitative, it's going to go a couple of different routes. For this instance, we're going qualitative. So the way that problem statements will start qualitatively is it is not known how, it is not known why, it is not known how or why. Sometimes it is not known what if we're doing a grounded theory study, but those are pretty tough. And so most of the time they're going to start with it is not known how, it is not known why. In this instance, our gap is asking about how, so that's what we're going to put in here. It is not known how. And then we're just going to take our gap and we're going to turn it into a sentence. It is not known how chairs choose which proposals to pass or fail. Maybe we could phrase this a little bit better. It is not known how chairs, yeah, that'll work. Okay, so much like I did on the last one, I'm going to copy this how to the end of our sentence. So I'm going to copy that there, and then we're going to use that to drive our other items down below. Since we're doing a qualitative here, we're going to be looking at a phenomenon. So the purpose statement, just like quantitative, starts a very specific way. The purpose of this, and then again, we're going to have to list our method, our design, our problem statement, our target population, and our location. In this instance, we know that what we're dealing with is a qualitative method, because that's one. What the gap was suggesting was a how, and how is a qualitative question. We can't ask how with words, or rather with numbers. We have to answer how questions with words. So it's got to be a qualitative study. The purpose of this, qualitative. Now we got to talk about design. GCU has 5 pre-approved qualitative designs. That's case study, narrative, phenomenological, grounded theory, and descriptive. As an aside, you excuse me, can use other designs that are not pre-approved, but it adds a lot of time to the process. So if at all possible, stick within one of those pre-approved GCU designs for either the quantitative side if that's the route you're going, or the qualitative side if that's the route you're going. In this instance, let's say that we're going to be doing a phenomenological study. So the purpose of this qualitative phenomenological study, and then I'm going to throw in a few words, let's say is to explore, I'm literally going to paste in my problem statement like I did earlier, how chairs choose which proposals to pass or fail. So I've got my method, I've got my design, I've got my problem statement. Now I need to do my target population. how chairs, let's see, choose which proposals to pass or fail at a private university in the Southwest. So we're looking at chairs at a private university, but it would kind of seem a little redundant here, how chairs choose which proposals to pass or fail for chairs at a private university in the Southwest. So sometimes you're going to have to wordsmith it a little bit just to make sure that it still sounds correct. So that's, we could do a few things with that here. But for the sake of alignment, I'm going to leave it as it is. So now we have the purpose of this qualitative phenomenological study is to explore how chairs choose which proposals to pass or fail at a private university in the Southwest. We have our method, design, problem statement, target population, and location. Again, just like on the quantitative side, we need at least 2 research questions. However, on the quantitative side, every variable has to be tied back to a theoretical framework. On the qualitative side, the phenomenon has to be tied back to that theoretical framework. And it needs to be really clear how the theory is driving our research questions. So our research question becomes, again, it's not a yes or no question. So it might be something, how do chairs choose which proposals to pass or fail? Again, copied and pasted our problem statement, turning it into a research question. Now let's say that there's a theory out there that deals with this, and they say that there's 3 important things in proposals that chairs are examining. For the sake of argument, I'm just going to call them thing 1, thing 2, and thing 3. So if that's what our theory says, I'm going to incorporate that theory into our research question here. How do chairs choose which proposals to pass or fail when examining thing 1, whatever that might be based on theory, and then again, thing 2 and thing 3. So these things here are really being driven by our theoretical framework, because again, there has to be a clear alignment between our theory and our research questions. So far we've got our phenomenon on here, or our research questions rather. So let's go ahead and put our phenomenon. Again, I'm going to copy and paste our problem statement up here. And I'm going to add the word understanding to the start of our phenomenon here, and then literally just paste my problem statement, the latter part of that. Understanding how chairs choose which proposals to pass or fail. So that's going to be the phenomenon that we're going to study. And just like I said on the last one, I brought up method and design because it is one of our 10 strategic points. And again, just so that it helps the learners know which one is the method, which one is the design. So as you guys are going back and looking at these 10 points, it becomes easy to see that. So this would be a well-aligned 5 of our 10 points for a qualitative study. I hope this was helpful for you guys. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out and I will see what I can do. And let me know if you guys have any feedback. Thanks, guys.